Chapter 1. The Sound of Silence. My first language was sign. I was born shortly after midnight, July 1st, 1933, my parents' first child. Thus I had one tiny reluctant foot in the first half of that historically fateful year, and the other firmly planted in the second half. In a way, my birth date, squarely astride the calendar year, was a metaphor for my subsequent life, one foot always being dragged back to the deaf world, the silent world of my father and of my mother, from whose womb I had just emerged, and the other trying to stride forward into the greater world of the hearing, to escape into the world destined to be my own. Many years later, I realized what a great expression of optimism it was for my father and mother, two deaf people, to decide to have a child at the absolute bottom of the Great Depression. We lived in Brooklyn, near Coney Island, where on certain summer days, when the wind was blowing just right and our kitchen window was open and the shade drawn up on its roller, I could smell the briny odor of the ocean, layered with just the barest hint of mustard and grilled hot dogs, although that could have been my imagination. Our apartment was 4 rooms on the 3rd floor of a new red brick building encrusted with bright orange fire escapes, which my father and mother had found by walking the neighborhood, and then negotiated for with the impatient hearing landlord all by themselves, despite their respective parents' objections that they could not manage alone, as they were deaf and handicapped, and helpless, and would surely be cheated. They had just returned from their honeymoon, spent blissfully in Washington, D.C., planned to coincide with the silent, colorful explosion of the blossoming cherry trees, which my mother considered a propitious omen for the successful marriage of 2 deaf people. Apartment 3A was the only home my father ever knew as a married man. Its 4 rooms were the place he lived with and loved his deaf wife, and raised his 2 hearing sons, and then left by ambulance one day 44 years after arriving there, never to return. One day, my father's hand signed in sorrow and regret the story of how he had become deaf. This was a story he had pieced together from facts he had learned later in life from his younger sister Rose, who in turn had heard it from their mother. The fact that he had to learn the details of his own deafness from his younger hearing sister was a source of enduring resentment. My father told me he had been born in 1902, a normal hearing child, but at an early age had contracted spinal meningitis. His parents, David and Rebecca, newly arrived in America from Russia, living in an apartment in the Bronx, thought their baby would die. My father's fever ravaged his little body for over a week. Cold baths during the day and wet sheet-shrouded nights kept him alive. When his fever at last abated, he was deaf. My father would never again hear a sound in all the remaining years of his life. As an adult, he often questioned why it was that he had been singled out as the only member of his family to become deaf. I, his hearing son, watched his hand sign his anguish. Not fair. My father and his father could barely communicate with each other. Their entire shared vocabulary consisted of a few mimed signs: eat, be quiet, sleep. These were all command signs. They had no sign for love between them, and his father died without ever having had a single meaningful conversation with his firstborn child. My father's mother did have a sign for love. It was a homemade sign, and she would use it often. My father told me that his language with his mother was poor in quantity, but rich in content. She communicated less through agreed-upon signs than through the luminosity that appeared in her eyes whenever she looked at him. That look was special and reserved for him alone. Like their parents, my father's siblings, his younger brother, Leon, and his 2 younger sisters, Rose and Millie, never learned a word of formal sign. They remained strangers to him his entire life. At my father's graveside, Leon screamed his name as if, finally, his dead, deaf brother had been granted the power to hear his name on his brother's lips. In 1910, when he was 8 years old, my father's parents sent him to live at the Fanwood School for the Deaf, a military-style school for deaf children. My father thought they had abandoned him because he was damaged. In his early days there he cried himself to sleep every night. But ever so slowly he came to realize that rather than having been abandoned, he had been rescued. For the first time in his life, he was surrounded by children just like him, and he finally understood that he was not alone in this world. However, the education he received at Fanwood was certainly a mixed blessing. There, as at most deaf schools at the time, deaf children were taught mainly by hearing teachers, whose goal was to teach them oral speech. The deaf are not mute, they have vocal cords and can speak, but since they cannot monitor the sound of their voice, teaching them intelligible speech is extraordinarily difficult. Although my father and his classmates tried to cooperate with their teachers, not one of them ever learned to speak well enough to be understood by the average hearing person. While this futile and much resented pedagogic exercise was being inflicted on the deaf children, sign language was strictly forbidden. The hearing teachers considered it to be a primitive method of communication suitable only for the unintelligent. Not until the 1960s would linguists decree ASL, American Sign Language, to be a legitimate language all its own. But long before then the deaf, among them the children at my father's school, had come to that conclusion themselves. Every night in the dormitory at Fanwood, the older deaf children taught the younger ones the visual language of sign. With sign, the boundaries of my father's silent mental universe disappeared, and in the resulting opening sign after new sign accumulated, expanding the closed space within his mind until it filled to bursting with joyous understanding. When I was a boy, I was sent to deaf school. I had no real signs, my father signed to me, his hands moving, remembering. I had only made-up home signs. These were like shadows on a wall. They had no real meaning. In deaf school, I was hungry for sign. All were new for me. Sign was the food that fed me, food for the eye, food for the mind. I swallowed each new sign to make it mine. My father's need to communicate was insatiable and would cease only when the dormitory lights were turned out at night. Even then, my father told me, he would sign himself to sleep. Once asleep, my father claimed, he would dream and sign. My father was taught the printing trade in deaf school, an ideal trade, it was thought, for a deaf man, as printing was a painfully loud business. The unspoken message transmitted to the deaf children of that time by their hearing teachers was that they were neither as smart nor as capable as hearing children. Thus, they would primarily be taught manual skills like printing, shoe repair, and house painting. Upon graduation in 1920, my father was able to land his first job, the job that would last his working lifetime. In the Great Depression, he told me, I was lucky to have an apprentice job with the New York Daily News. I knew it was because I was deaf, so wouldn't be distracted by the noise of the printing presses and the clattering of the linotype machines, but I didn't care. I also didn't care that the deaf workers were paid less than the hearing workers because Captain Patterson, the big boss, knew that we couldn't complain. He knew that we would be happy for any job, at any wage. We were deaf. He could hear, and he was right. The hearing people ran the world. But those were tough times for me. By the time I gave my mother money out of my small pay envelope at the end of the week for my room and board, and then some more for the household expenses, there was not much left over. My hearing brother and sisters did not have steady work. My mother and father were the janitors of our building, so they had little ready cash. It broke my heart to see my mother on her hands and knees, shuffling up and down the hallways, washing the wooden floors with hot soapy water she dragged along behind her in a big wooden bucket. Her hands were always red and raw. To this day I can't get the memory of her chafed hands out of my mind. When I finally got my union card and made good union wages, I could give her enough money every month so she didn't have to do that anymore. You can't imagine how proud I was that I, her deaf son, could do that for her. As an apprentice, he explained to me, he worked the night shift. It was known as the lobster shift, for no reason that he was ever able to explain to me. As a boy, I reasoned that since he worked nights while everyone else was asleep, including fish in the ocean, it must be that lobsters were awake during those hours, and hence the name. Being a printer was the only job my father ever had, and he loved it. He would work for the newspaper until he retired over 40 years later. In all that time, he worked side by side with hearing coworkers, but he never really knew them. Like most in the hearing world, they treated him as if he were an alien, primitive, incapable of speech, and lacking human thought, a person to be avoided if possible, and if not, ignored. After an apprenticeship of many years, my father was issued a union card. It was the proudest moment of his life. It was tangible proof that he was as good as any hearing man. Even in the dark days of the Depression, when 1 out of 4 men were out of work, he, a deaf man, could support himself. And, he reasoned, he could also support a wife. My father was tired of being alone in this hearing world. It was time, he thought, to create his own silent world, a world that would begin with a deaf wife. One bleak winter day, while we were sitting at the kitchen table, the rain sleeting against the windows of our Brooklyn apartment, his hands told me the rest of his story, in which began my story. Sarah was a young girl. She had many friends. She liked to have fun. I first noticed her at the beach in Coney Island. She was always laughing. All the deaf boys were crazy about Sarah, even the hearing boys. There were many handsome boys on the beach. All the young boys had muscles and chocolate tans. They could jump and leap over each other's backs. They could do handstands. I was older. I didn't have muscles. I couldn't stand on my hands if my life depended on it. I didn't have a brown tan. I would get sunburned. My skin turned red, and then I would peel. It didn't matter. The handsome young boys with their chocolate skin and big muscles only wanted to have fun with Sarah. They were not serious boys. They had no jobs. So they had plenty of time to play and make muscles and get brown skin from the sun. I was a serious man. I had a job, a good job, the best job. I was no longer an apprentice printer. I had a union card just like the hearing workers. I didn't want Sarah just to have fun. I wanted a wife for all time. I wanted a mother for my children. I wanted a partner forever. We would be 2 deaf people in the hearing world. We would make our own world, a quiet world, a silent world. We would be strong together and strong for our children. Then, just as the rain stopped and thin rays of sunlight striped the tabletop, my father smiled to himself, his hands thinking, maybe we would have a little fun before the children came. Lost in reverie, his hands, bathed in golden light, now lay silent on the kitchen table. Time passed. I sat and watched his still hands, waiting patiently for them to continue his story. I loved the quiet time we spent together, and I loved the stories his hands contained. Then my father's hands came alive again, eloquently describing a warm spring afternoon in 1932 Brooklyn. I knew I had to make a good impression. I had to dress well. I wore my best suit. Actually, it was my only suit. The Big Depression was still going strong, and I watched every dollar. He tells me his suit was a fine wool serge that cost him 2 weeks' salary. Its jaunty design was at odds with the feeling of dread that grew in him that day as he set off for the apartment where Sarah lived with her family, having written to her father asking if he might pay a call. The scene unfolds with cinematic vividness as my father's hands recount each stage of his quest. He descends with the crowd, down the stairs from the subway platform, sweat dampening his armpits, and exits the station into the frantic gay activity of Sabbath shoppers rushing about, making their last-minute purchases for the evening meal. The salt scent of the Atlantic Ocean hangs over every shop awning, every outdoor stall, reminding my father, as if he needed such a reminder, how far he had traveled this warm day from his familiar home in the northern leafy village reaches of the Bronx, after 1 trolley ride and 3 subway transfers, to the very end of Brooklyn, on the honky-tonk shore of Coney Island. And why has he come here on this warm spring day, sweat pooling at the base of his spine, palms moistly clutching now wilted store-bought flowers? Today, this very afternoon, my father will meet, for the first time, the family of the girl he has chosen to be his wife. Unfortunately for him, my future mother, waiting at home, believes he is hopelessly boring and much too old for her. Besides, she feels she's too young to be married, there being so much fun to be had with all the good-looking boys who flutter around her like bees around a hive of honey every weekend on the hot sand of Bay 6, their hands gesturing wildly to gain her exclusive attention. And she could not banish from her mind the image of the hearing golden boy, whose attentions she enjoyed so much and who said he loved her. Glancing nervously at the written directions, my father marches down the broad, bustling avenue, so unlike the uneventful Bronx Street where he lives. His hands at his sides rehearse the arguments he will employ this afternoon to convince this dark-haired young girl and her father that he is the one to whom she should commit her future. He has been marshalling the arguments in his favor for the past 2 weeks. He has a steady job and a union card. He is mature and serious. He is a loyal and dependable fellow, calm in an emergency. He can read, he can write, he can sign fluently, and if she will have him, he will love her forever. He finds himself impressed with his qualifications as he cycles through them. He is an up-and-comer. Besides, he has a full head of hair parted perfectly down the middle and a dandy mustache, and is altogether a fine-looking fellow. 15 crowded blocks from the subway station, on a narrow tree-lined side street, he finds her apartment building, fronted with a narrow stoop, a 5-story walk-up in a typical dumbbell front-to-back floor arrangement. Up goes my father, up the stone steps of the stoop, up the 5 flights of spongy wooden stairs, up through the hallway smells of cooking and laundry and close immigrant living. Arriving at the door of 5B, he pauses. His future lies behind the dark wooden door. He thinks, what if her parents don't like him? What if they disapprove of him? What if they think he is too deaf? What will he do if they don't give their blessings to his cause? How will he endure if he cannot have this magnificent girl for his wife? He'll do anything, he thinks, to win their approval. He'll even move to Brooklyn, if that is the price he must pay to be accepted. He knocks. The door opens, and he is greeted by a compact, tightly coiled, unsmiling man in a mismatched jacket and pants who waves at him, making clumsy, unintelligible signs with his large, paint-stained hands. My father does not understand a word he is saying, but reasons that this is a greeting of sorts, and an invitation to enter the apartment. My father enters and in a single glance takes in the entirety of the apartment. From front to back, cheek to jowl, it is filled with large, mismatched pieces of heavy dark wood furniture buffed to a high shine. There seems to be at least 2 of everything, leaving barely space to move about. My father thinks this apartment looks more like a furniture shop on the Lower East Side than a living space. Unbeknownst to him, my mother's father had rented all this furniture and arranged for it to be delivered just that morning with the thought of impressing him, the suitor of his daughter. My father is not impressed. He is confused. My mother sits at one of the 2 dining room tables, and as my father signs his excited greeting to her, she bursts into tears. On the 2 couches, staring expressionlessly at my father, sit the family, mother, 3 sons, and another daughter. Confused by the abundance of furniture, the stony looks of the family, and the tears of my mother, my father wonders what he has gotten himself into. He finally seats himself in one of the 12 chairs surrounding the 2 dining room tables, facing the family. At once, as if in a coin-operated game at Coney Island, the frozen tableau comes to life, and all the members of my mother's family break into excited gestures and frantic hand and arm waving. They are trying to put my father at ease, but their homemade signs are virtual, Greek to his eyes. Perhaps, my father thinks, this is a Brooklyn accent. My father smiles politely and occasionally nods in agreement at what he thinks is the appropriate time. My mother wipes her tears away, and for the first time since her father opened the front door, she smiles a shy, tentative smile. All doubt and confusion depart from my father's mind. He addresses her father and begins to make his case in simple sign language and written notes. My mother's father does not understand a word my father is saying. He does not understand the signs. Must be a Bronx accent, he thinks, and my father's notes are largely incomprehensible to him. Nonetheless, he smiles from time to time behind his shaggy gray beard, nodding in tune with my father's broad gestures. Emboldened by the seeming agreement, my father grows more expansive in his signs, describing his position as a printer at the New York Daily News, the lobster ship to be sure, but daytime work just around the corner now that he has his union card. My mother translates what my father says in their homemade signs. Now her father smiles broadly and nods energetically. He feels confident that this serious young deaf man really is the answer to his prayers. This is someone who is from his daughter's world, someone who will be able to take care of her. My father has no more to say. He has made his case to the girl's father. But what of the girl? My father asks her father if he can take his daughter out for the rest of the afternoon. Perhaps a walk on the boardwalk. Yes, yes, by all means. The bearded face nods in agreement. My father and this beautiful girl walk on the boardwalk from Coney Island to Brighton Beach, then back again to the starting point. Although the girl has gone to the Lexington School for the Deaf and is as fluent in sign language as my father, they have said very little to each other. Now they rest on a bench and look at the waves rolling in, one after the other, with great interest, while their hands sit quietly in their laps. As the light fades from the sky over Coney Island, signaling the beginning of the end of this momentous day, my father takes my mother's hand in his strong printer's hands and gently squeezes her fingers. She returns the pressure with a slight acknowledging squeeze of her own. 1 week later, 3 strong young men climb 5 flights of wooden stairs and quickly remove all the splendid two-of-everything rented furniture. Rented by the day, it has served its purpose, now that my father has proposed and Sarah has accepted. On the return trip, the men bring up the original, shabby, mismatched pieces, which comes in ones, not twos. Shortly thereafter, Louis and Sarah were married. Barely 9 months after the wedding, at the height of a thunderstorm, I was born in Coney Island Hospital. My father's hands describe what that frightful day had been like. His hands appeared to be warding off something unknown that caused fear. It was a dreadful day, he signed, throwing out his hands from alongside his temples. Awful. It was the hottest day of the summer. All of Brooklyn lay stunned beneath the heat. The angry sun had baked the sands of Coney Island and turned the blue Atlantic into a sea of molten red. At dusk, the boiling sun continued on its way from Brooklyn to California, taking with it the light but leaving behind the heat. My father's hands told me how he paced the grimy linoleum floor of the hospital. From end to end in the airless hallway, he measured off his steps, 100 one way, 100 back again, and with each step he signed to himself his frustration and his fear. Back and forth, past his wife's room, past the weeping walls, he walked his endless circle of anxiety. He had been doing this for 10 hours, ever since his wife had been admitted after her waters broke so shockingly, signaling the impending birth of their first child. My father had no thought for the child who was taking his time to arrive, only for his wife, lying on sweat-drenched sheets in a room he was not permitted to enter, from which few, if any, news bulletins came his way. Some time after the sunset, a cold front suddenly moved in over Brooklyn, bringing with it a drop of 40 degrees in temperature. The cold air rear-ended the darkening, boiling mass in its path. Lightning split the sky, and rain fell in cold torrents onto the steaming asphalt streets of Coney Island. Day turned to darkest night. Soon the tar-topped street outside the hospital was filled from curb to curb with the rising tide of water. The sewers could not handle the overflow, and the water backed up, rising quickly above the hubcaps of the parked cars, flowing down neighboring cellar steps. The violent electric storm spawned winds that toppled trees and tore down telephone poles, while 5 floors above my father continued his solitary pacing, wondering how he could possibly exist in a world without his deaf wife, Sarah. Lightning struck oil tanks in New Jersey, sending flames hundreds of feet into the sky, turning night back into blazing day, and the wind tore down a circus tent in Queens, trapping 400 people beneath the rain-drenched canvas. All the windows of Brooklyn went dark as power lines fell like matchsticks, and my father became a father. I rushed out into the storm, raising my fist to the heavens, his hands told me. I was a crazy man. A Niagara of water submerged me, and all about bolts of lightning splintered the sky. Over the crashing sounds of this Olympian tumult, my father's deaf voice cried out, "God, make my son hear!" Could I hear? That was the question. The answer was he didn't know. But, his hands continued, we were determined to find out, and quickly. The reason for the doubt on my father's part was that he and his family had no sure way of knowing the reason for his own deafness. Yes, they all agreed. My father had been quite sick as a young boy. He had run a high fever and, when better, was discovered to have lost all hearing. The same was the case with my mother, who, it was thought, had scarlet fever when just a baby. But, their parents reasoned, the illness and the deafness were not necessarily connected. Their many other children had also been sick at one time or another, and they had also had high fevers, but they were not deaf. They did not have broken ears. Both sets of parents were dead set against our having children, my father signed. They thought a child of ours would be born deaf. They were ignorant immigrants from the old country. His hands beat the air angrily. What the hell did they know? Anyway, they treated us like children. Always. Even when we were adults ourselves. They couldn't help it. We were deaf, and so we were helpless in their minds. Like children. We would always be children to them. So we did not listen to them, and we had you. They were surprised when they saw how perfect you were. Nothing missing. A regular baby. A normal baby in their eyes. Mother Sarah and I loved you from the first time we saw you, but secretly some part of us wished you were born deaf. Although I loved my father and mother, I could not imagine being part of their deaf world, and I could not understand why even the smallest secret part of them could wish such a fate for me. You were our first child, his hands explained. We were deaf in a hearing world. There was no one to tell us how to raise a hearing child. We did not have the hearing language to ask, and hearing people did not have our language to tell us. We were on our own, always. There was no one to help us. How were we to know what you wanted, what you needed? How were we to know when you cried in the dark, when you were hungry, happy, sad, when you had a pain in your stomach? And how, he said, would we tell you we loved you? My father paused. His hands were still, thoughtful. I was afraid I would not know you if you were a hearing baby. I feared you would not know your deaf father. Then he smiled. Mother Sarah was not worried. She said she was your mother. She would know you. She said you were the son from her body, and you would know your mother. There was no need for mouth speak, no need for hand speak. When we brought you home from the hospital, we arranged for Mother Sarah's family to come to our apartment every Saturday afternoon. Urgent, I wrote. You must come every week, Saturday. They listened. They came from Coney Island every Saturday for all of your first year of life. They never missed all of them. Mother Sarah's mother and father, and her younger sister and 3 younger brothers. They ate like horses, but it was worth it. How boring that must have been for them, I signed, pressing my finger to my nose as if to a grindstone wheel. We didn't care. I had a plan, he signed vigorously. They always came when you were sleeping. I made sure of that. Before making themselves comfortable, I asked them to stand at the back of your crib. Then they pounded on pots and pans I gave them. You heard a big noise and snapped awake, and you began to wail. It was a wonderful sight to see you cry so strongly at the heavy noise sound." "Wonderful?" I asked. "Wonderful for who? Now I know why I have trouble sleeping some nights." My father continued, ignoring my complaint. "We celebrated. Mother Sarah served them tea and honey cake. When no one was looking, your Hungarian grandfather, Max the Gypsy, slipped booze into his tea from a silver flask he carried. As he sipped his tea, he would add another shot. Soon his teacup was filled just with whiskey, and he would sip and smile, smile and sip, all afternoon long. 'Ah, thank God Myron can hear,' he would mumble as he took another sip. Your grandmother Celia would look at him in her tight-lipped way like he was a cockroach she had surprised when turning on the kitchen light late at night. She always looked like she wanted to step on him. No one seemed to notice this, but we deaf see everything. I see more meaning in one blink of an eye than my hearing brother and sisters hear in an hour-long conversation. They understand nothing. The mouth speaks words they hear but teach them nothing. I love my brother and sisters, but they are not as smart as me." "No matter, that's not part of your hearing story. That's another story." My father's memories were so intense and so tightly woven together in his mind that in the midst of telling one story, he would often wander off into another one that rose to the surface almost as if it had been bottled up all these years and, now that there was someone to tell it to, had just worked itself free. When he did so, he would catch himself and terminate the beginning of the new memory by abruptly signing, "Another story." And then I knew that, somewhere down the road, I would hear from him this other story. On Sundays, my mother, father, brother, and 2 sisters came down from the Bronx. They did not trust Mother Sarah's family. They brought their own pots and pans. Each one held a pot or a pan on their lap during the 2-hour, 3-subway ride trip from way up in the Bronx to Kings Highway in Brooklyn. They practiced banging on the pots and pans while the subway cars went careening through the tunnels. The train's wheels made such a screeching sound that people on the car barely noticed them. When they got off the subway, my sisters and brother marched to our apartment house, still banging the pots and pans. They looked like some ragtag army in a Revolutionary War painting. As soon as they arrived at our apartment, they hid behind the head of your bed and pounded away, while they stomped their feet like a marching band. I felt the loud noise through the soles of my feet. They had a nice rhythm. The result was the same. You awoke immediately. Jumped, actually. "This went on for a whole year?" I asked. "Yes, they thought your hearing might go away, just as hearing for me and Mother Sarah went away when we were young. Big mystery." "How about our neighbors? All that banging and stomping, didn't they mind?" I asked. "What do you expect?" my father answered. "We had to know if your hearing stayed with you. The neighbors threatened to call the landlord, have us evicted. Mother Sarah sweet-talked them out of it. The notes flew fast and furious between them till they settled down. Anyway, they thought you were a cute baby. They also wondered if you could hear. They wondered if the deaf can have a hearing baby. We were the only deaf people they knew. They had no idea of our deaf ways." Thinking for a minute, his hands added, striking each other sharply, "It was hard for Mother Sarah and me to figure out how to take care of you, but we did. We learned how to tell when you cried at night. You slept in your crib next to our bed when we brought you home from the hospital. We kept the small light on all night. Mother Sarah wore a ribbon attached to her wrist and to your sweet baby foot. When you moved your foot, she would immediately awaken to see the reason why. She still has that ribbon somewhere. Sign was your first language. The first sign you learned was 'I love you.' That is a good sign, the best sign." Memorabilia. A fox in Brooklyn. Memory unwinds like the steel spring of a wind-up clock. I see myself as a small child, still so young that I am sleeping in my parents' bedroom. I'm dressed in feet pajamas that sport a practical drop-down seat flap. It is night. Something wakes me, so I go to wake my father. My hand on his shoulder was my first form of communication, touch. Soon after touch came sign, another language of hands. What? He jerks upright at the insistent shaking of his shoulder, simultaneously signing to me. His upturned hands wiggle imploringly, back and forth, demanding an answer. His face is a mask of puzzlement and inquiry. His shoulders hunched up in expectation of an answer. What? His long, drawn-out sign demands. Since he is deaf and I can hear, he cannot permit any misunderstanding between us. What was one of the earliest signs I remember acquiring. Almost every exchange between my deaf father and me began with the sign for what. My answer would decode many things for him. My needs, my feelings, my emotions, my state of mind, my request for information. Virtually all communication between us took off from my response to that question. What? With this essential foundational exchange accomplished, he was able to proceed appropriately. On this night at midnight, the what was my fear. "I heard a noise," I signed, pointing to my ear and banging my small fists together. Since I was scared of the noise, my fists beat a strong tattoo against each other. My father stilled my hands and got out of bed. "Show me," he signed. I think back on that exchange between my father and me so very long ago and realize that it must have been the first time I realized my father was deaf. How could I show him the sound? I took his hand in mine and pointed it to the closet. That's where the sound was coming from. As I clung to his leg, he opened the closet door. There, from the darkness, staring down at me, was the furry face of a fox, its bright, unblinking eyes looking straight into mine, its small, pointy ears taking in the sound of my choked, whimpering sobs. I looked back through half-closed, wet eyelids, squinting in reflexive fear, as I saw the fox hunching his shoulders, preparing to spring at me. His gaping, narrow mouth was filled with hundreds of small, white, pointy teeth. I could feel those teeth shredding my arm. I screamed for my mother, but my mother slept on, her back turned to the sight of her only child about to be eaten alive. Doesn't she care? My young mind could not process the fact that she could not hear the fox's snarling, hungry anticipation of biting down on her son's soft, fleshy arm. With his hands, my father grabbed the fox by the neck and yanked him from his perch. Shaking the fox back and forth, he squeezed the life out of him. Now the eyes of the fox turned glassy, all life drained away. The fox hung limply, tail down, lifeless, in my father's strong hands, hands that gently held me, stroked my head, hugged me, and spoke to me. "Don't be afraid. The fox won't bother you any more." Throwing the dead fox on the floor of the closet, he slammed the door on my nightmare, wiped the tears from my eyes, and led me back to my bed. As he tucked me tightly under my quilt, he looked at me for the longest time, a half-smile on his lips. Then, holding my face in his hands, he softly kissed me, and I went to sleep. This recollection was for a long time a sharp pebble on the far shore of memory. From time to time, as I walked the beach of my childhood memories, I would step barefooted on that particular pebble. What exactly was that fearsome creature lurking in the closet that so infected my dreams? Surely there were no wild foxes running around in Brooklyn, at least not on my block, not in my apartment, and certainly not in my parents' closet. Many years later, I realized that the monster my father killed for me that night must have been my mother's fox fur stole.